All right. So today what we're going to go over is we're going to go over what are the limits to endurance performance. And so a lot of these things are things that we've covered just briefly as we've been going through the various things that we've discussed over the last couple of days. Right? So by the end of this series of videos, you should be able to name the things that limit our endurance performance, describe the role of VO2 max in performance, just define lactate threshold and how it affects endurance performance. You should be able to define movement economy and how it limits endurance. Name the best determinant of endurance performance, which is a combination of lactate threshold and movement economy, which we know as the power, velocity, or speed at lactate threshold. So the higher your speed at lactate threshold, your power, your velocity at lactate threshold, the faster you're going to be in an endurance race. Okay, and that's really the best determinant of endurance performance. You should be able to write the equation that describes VO2 max. You should be able to state 4 ways to increase oxygen delivery to muscle. So what are the adaptations that our body does to increase oxygen delivery to muscle? You should be able to name the signaling pathway that's required for exercise-induced cardiac hypertrophy. And again, this is one of the things that we are going to see is that what we were doing with endurance exercise, one of the things is to increase we have a volume overload hypertrophy of the heart, which means our heart is bigger and it can pump more blood. In order to do that, it needs to be a little bit thicker so you get a cardiac hypertrophy. And it's a little bit different. The signaling is a little bit different than how we get skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And so I'm just going to briefly discuss that just so you know that there is a lot of similarities, but there is some difference as well. And then you're going to be able to name a key transcriptional cofactor that drives the increase in capillary density that occurs as a result of endurance exercise. All right, so the first thing we can do is we start with the first component of endurance, and that's VO2 max. And what VO2 max is the maximum volume of oxygen that can be used to produce energy. All right, so it's in a single athlete at a single time. The limit of your ability to produce energy aerobically is this number, your VO2 max. But really, this is like, it's an ante. As if you're in performance, VO2 max, yeah, you need to have a certain VO2 max to get into the game, to be involved in this. But it's not going to be the primary determinant of who's going to win and who's going to lose. Okay, so we talk about it being an ante in a poker game. That's how much you have to pay to be allowed to play. All right. So the VO2 max that gets you into the game, if you're a high school athlete, is relatively low. A college athlete, it's going to be pretty high. A national level athlete, now we're talking bigger numbers that get you in. You might have been really good at college, but maybe it's not quite good enough to get you in at the national level. And maybe that national level isn't quite good enough to get you in at the Olympic level. But once you get above that certain threshold, now whether you're going to win or lose that race isn't really going to be determined by your VO2 max. It's going to be determined by other things. And the easiest way to see that is by looking at some very simple data. And this is a maximal treadmill test on national level runners who are either from Scandinavia, these Caucasian athletes, or from East Africa. And so when we think of endurance running, like a max treadmill test, we think of the greatest endurance runners right now are coming from East Africa. And it's from a small area of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, where we're getting most of the people who are winning the large majority of the distance races at the Olympic World Championship level. But if we look to see who's got a bigger VO2 max, an East African runner or a Caucasian runner, these are all national or international level runners, look at the VO2 max here, or the VO2 peak. VO2 peak in the Caucasians about 70, whereas in the African athletes, it's about 60, 61. So what that tells us is that if all of the Olympic medals are being won by these East African athletes who are coming from this small area, and yet their VO2 max is 10 points lower than Caucasian athletes who are coming from Scandinavia, then maybe VO2 max isn't going to be the biggest determinant of who's going to win the Olympic medals. And when you think about it, what drives a big high VO2 max isn't necessarily, you have to be using your muscle, and you have to be using it aerobically. But what these Scandinavian athletes are doing is in the off season, it snows. And when it snows and you've got these big open spaces, you go out and you do Nordic skiing. And so now when you take this Scandinavian athlete, now they're actually, when they're training in the winter, they're using their legs like they're going to do when they go back to running, but they're also using their arms and their upper body and their back, so they have a bigger muscle mass. And when you use a bigger muscle mass, now your heart needs to supply a greater volume of muscle. And so in order to do that, it's going to have a need to do a greater adaptation. It's going to need to get bigger. And the bigger your heart, the bigger your VO2 max is. And so the result is that these Scandinavian athletes are going to have a bigger VO2 max. But when we talk about running performance, we're often going to see an East African athlete winning the world championships or the Olympic medals. And it's not because they have the highest VO2 max, it's because of something else. In fact, if you look at this great study by Andy Jones, who got one of his friends when he was still an athlete and this is Paula Radcliffe in this paper, basically what he did is he looked at her best 3,000 meter time here between 1991 and 1995. She didn't compete in the 3,000 in 94. And then what he did also is he measured her VO2 max. And what you can see is that her time is improving. She's knocked almost 40 seconds, a little bit more than 40 seconds, 45 seconds off of her 3,000 meter time, and yet her VO2 max has declined. Why did her VO2 max decline? Well, because VO2 max is going to be related to your cardiac output. And as you age, your maximum heart rate comes down. And so what happens is your VO2 max can decline as you age, even over a 5-year period like this. So her VO2 max has come down, but her performance has improved. And so if it's not VO2 max, what else could it be? Well, this is now measuring her running economy. Running economy is how much oxygen she uses to run a certain speed. What you can see is she's getting more economical as a runner. She's going from 53 milliliters per kilogram per minute down to 47. So she uses less oxygen because she stores and returns more energy. And that means that this number, this performance number, her VO2 max is coming down, but that's okay because her economy is coming up. So VO2 max is only one component. Economy and the other component is lactate threshold are going to be other things that are important.